The world appears to be getting richer and China one step closer to becoming a high-income country. According to the latest World Bank annual GNI report, China remains an upper middle-income economy for the year 2025, but its gross national income per capita has reached $14,230, in other words, just about $150 short of the high-income economy threshold. Meanwhile, 6 other economies have moved up the income ladder and no economies have slipped. So what do the numbers tell us? How are you affected? We'll explain all of that, or try to. Welcome to this special edition of The Point with me, Li Xin, an opinion show coming to you live from Beijing. I'm pleased to be joined from London by John Ross, Senior Fellow at the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at Renmin University of China. From Hangzhou in eastern China's Zhejiang Province, Liang Yan, Kremer Chair Professor of Economics at William Met University. And here in the studio, Zhang Gong, Professor of Economics at the University of International Business and Economics. We're also joined on the phone from Shanghai by He Weiwen, Senior Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. So let's get started, and welcome to all of you. We have a lot of ground to cover. But first of all, let me go to John in London. What's the difference between gross national income, or GNI, and gross national product, or GDP?
There's no big difference. In fact, they're quite frequently used interchangeably. What there is a significant difference to is to GDP, because GNI includes income generated by a country from abroad, whereas GDP is only the income which is generated within the country. For most countries, including China, their GDP and GNI, they're conceptually different. There is some difference, but they're more or less the same. But for some countries, the difference is very big between the two.
So how accurate is a GNI in terms of measuring an economy's or a people's level of income? Let's take a look at this chart. That's the very latest classification of whether a country is low income or middle income or high income. There you have it. And mind you that in the category of middle income, there are actually 2 subcategories. You have the lower middle income and the high middle income. And there is where China is. One of the higher middle income countries, but almost on the edge and inching towards the high income economies. And at the bottom you see the threshold, or the number in US dollars, which indicates about where the actual number is. So let me go to let me go to Professor Liang Yan here. What does it mean when China is reaching $14,230 US GNI per capita?
Well, that would mean China entered the so-called high-income country rank.
Already?
Now, China's, well, I mean, in terms of 2025, China's per capita GNI was $13,740. But when you look at this year, and GDP is forecasted to grow, or the target is 4.5 to 5%. So if this year China is able to even reach the lower end, it is able to enter to cross the line of the 2026 high income level threshold, which is projected at 14,375. So by that matrix, again, by 2026, I think most forecasts would put China into that high income country rank.
All right, but before we go further into China, let's also look at the world in general. According to the latest report, no country slipped in terms of income. Actually, 6 economies made a level higher. Togo, for instance, moved from low income to high income. Then 5 economies, including Vietnam, Jordan, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, Micronesia, moved from lower middle income economy to upper middle income economy. It's a mouthful, but Professor Gong, help us understand how they're doing and what does that mean?
Well, first of all, let me also compliment to what Liang Ying has said. She's been arguing that this year we're definitely going to get into the high income category, and my argument is that probably we are already in high income category right now because this is based on 2025 data, and these numbers are also subject to fluctuations in the foreign exchange ratios. And we know that the renminbi has appreciated substantively in the last few months. So if you based on the current exchange ratio between US dollar and RMB, my bet is that we're already in that high income category. We're only $150 behind, and that gap can be closed very easily by a very small uptick in RMB's appreciation. So that's about China.
Is it also the case for the other economies that I mentioned that move from lower to middle or from lower middle to upper middle?
Absolutely. It could be compelled by exchange ratio between US dollar and their local currencies, because the GDP number is actually calculated based on the domestic currencies, right? And then it's converted into dollar. So of course it's going to be affected by the exchange ratio. Speaking of these countries, the countries you have you just said, I remember a couple of them are growing pretty fast, like Vietnam. It's spectacular growth. Growth is even higher than China's. So it's not surprising to see that these countries are moving into the class. I also want to emphasize that these thresholds are being adjusted every year. You can see that it's being uplifted every year. So I think there's actually not so much of a meaning in interpreting these numbers, the categories of these economies. And these things are originally designed for making loans to these countries based on what interest rates the World Bank charges these countries.
Okay, so we're wasting our time, John.
Well, so very briefly, China is not borrowing too much from World Bank these days. So I think the higher interest rates, because we are in a high income category, doesn't really mean much from an economics point of view.
Okay, Mr. He Wei Wen on the phone. What do you think of this development that China is either very close to becoming a high income economy or already there, according to other calculations?
I think China is just 1% before entering into the high income economy. But still, high income economy is still a developing economy, because that measures different stages on the developing economies. So when we reach the high income level threshold this year, I'm sure that by this year, 2026, we will hit it. We will still be a developing economy. The only difference is that the World Bank will take this threshold as a new threshold for lending loans for the terms of the loans. That's the difference.
Any psychological impact that this might have? Because, people talk about the middle income trap, right? For country, we're not talking about a household here. John Ross, let me turn to you. It seems like this story is only for economists, not for the general public. What is your take?
I don't think it's for the for economists at all. It affects everybody's life. I mean, GDP is not a perfect indicator, or GNI is not a perfect indicator of the economy, but no one is. But if you look at real measures of human well-being, it's extraordinarily highly correlated. I mean, you take the most basic of all, life expectancy, for example, which is the most objective of all indicators, because you're either alive or dead, right? The correlation between the level of GDP per capita, or GNI per capita, which is very close to it, and life expectancy is 0.73, which means basically there are some countries which do better than you would expect at a given level of income. China does, incidentally. You live about 2 years longer than you would expect from its level of GNI per capita. And in the US, you live about 2 years less. But nevertheless, it's overwhelmingly dominated by that. And the importance of life expectancy, it sums up all the good things, income, good health, good education, good environment, takes out the negative ones, poverty, environmental pollution, bad health, and gives you a single number. So it is not perfect, but no number is perfect, but it's a fantastically good indicator, and nobody has come up with one that is actually even nearly as good. So I think it's a big deal.
Yeah, well, let's talk about it. That's why we're talking about it. Let me show you another chart, chart number 2, and that's how China has traversed, how, the journey that China has made. And there you have it. In the in the beginning of China's reform and opening up, the number or the GNI number was very low, and then the climb started about 1990s, and then it was a very steep climb up, very impressive. So I want to go to Professor Liang. What do you make of this chart?
Well, like you said, this is remarkable that China is able to achieve such a high level of income growth in such a short period and lifted over 800 million people out of abject poverty. So I think this is a great accomplishment. I think this whole sort of game about pushing China away from the so-called developing country status is really the United States' gambit. The idea is to end China's trade and economic privileges as a developing country and also shift from the climate and environmental sort of burdens onto China. And that's why the United States has pressured the World Bank to end any concessional loans to China by 2031. And so that's the whole idea of claiming that China is a high income country and therefore a developed country, then China should forego some of these privileges. But China's response is very interesting. I think China itself has voluntarily actually forfeit this kind of special and differential treatments at the WTO. But China insisted that it is still a developing country because it still has a long way to go.
Well, this is very
improve.
interesting. So I was going to put that off in just a moment. But since we keep coming back, let's talk about it. Does high income economy necessarily correlate to developed economy? Because in the high income bracket or basket, there are 87 economies. You don't have that many developed countries in the world, Professor Liang. And it's not just a concept that China is happy to keep. There is some kind of criteria there, right?
Absolutely. I think GNI is a very important indicator, but there is broader matrix that indicates structural and qualitative aspects of the economy to be labeled as, for example, developed countries. Now, I think China's GNI is definitely putting it into a higher income level countries. But there's still ways to improve, right? In terms of educational levels and life expectancy, which are the two other indicators for the HDI, the Human Development Indicator. Now, again, China has gone a long way. It is right now at the so-called high HDI. It's only 0.003 from the so-called very high HDI. But still, I think China insists.
HDI is the Human Development Index, right?
Right.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
That is a United Nations concept. To define country whether it's in developing or developed as part of the evaluation matrix. Yeah. But again, I think China really resonates with the developing South, because it has the same colonial history, it has the same ambition of growth and also change the global order and continue to improve its living standards and equality of the country. So I think that is why China still wants to maintain the kind of developing countries nation.
Yeah, I still have to make it clear. Or my opinion is that it's not a matter whether China wants to be a developing country or whether China has certain views. It's because of some hard numbers, hard criteria that we're talking about. But let's get away from that topic a little bit because, the people who want to change this name for China, they're not going to listen to us. They're not going to agree. They're just going to keep talking. Let's talk about the middle income trap, which I think is a much more relevant topic, Mr. He. I don't know whether you agree. Because there has been this talk of, the countries that are so-called in the middle income trap, and there are 108 countries as of 2024, according to the World Bank, and China was one of it. So by moving into the high income category, does that mean that China has escaped the so-called middle income trap?
I think we should distinguish clearly the middle income trap between middle income trap and middle income developing stage. I think the middle income is a long development stage. The threshold for high medium income economy is $4,000. China hit it in 2010. Then the higher income threshold is 14,000, so almost 3.5 times higher. So taking into account of the population growth, so the total economic size should double and double again during this period. It will normally take 25 to 30 years, if we keep a growth rate of 6% per year, that's pretty good. So the stage of low middle income development stage will take 25 to 30 years. That's quite normal. If an economy cannot take out in 40 or even longer time, we think it is middle income trap. We should not say that once you enter the middle income economy, you will fall into the trap. That's a wrong conception. We should distinguish it. And we say that China has taken over 16 years to move to cross over from middle income to higher middle income. That higher income, that's a good improvement.
So let's talk about this concept, John Ross. I mean, yeah, I have two Johns in the show, but John Ross, what are we talking about when we talk about middle income trap? Do we have some kind of idea?
What it means is, if all economies grow at the same rate, then nobody ever gains would change their status, because the thresholds would just go up equally. So if China grew at 2% and the US grew at 2%, China would never close the income gap between the US, and it would never change its relative status. And probably because the criteria change each year, it would never change. The difference, therefore, is in relative growth. What's striking about China is, therefore, that it's maintained a far higher than average growth rate over a very prolonged period of time. Because you can't go from the situation where China was, because at the beginning of this process, we go way back to 1949, China was almost the poorest country in the world. The statistics show only 10 countries in the world, chiefly in sub-Saharan Africa, had a lower per capita GDP than China. So, of course, it's taken decades and decades and decades to get to a high-income economy. China has, purely statistically speaking, the highest prolonged period of economic growth of any country, any major country in human history. It's a completely unparalleled achievement, and that's not to be polite because I'm on Chinese television. It's just that's just a fact about the situation, and that's what is absolutely remarkable about it. Yeah. And that's what means in overcoming the low income, the middle income trap. It means not merely growing at an average rate, which leaves you unchanged in your position, but it means growing at a faster rate than other countries and achieving becoming high income status.
Yeah, there's your understanding. Let's pull up that chart again then, I don't think for the Chinese television to talk about that chart, to show that chart twice, it's not self-boasting or arrogance. We're just talking about the facts. Let's look at that chart again, if we can, and can we have that trajectory again? It's a remarkable story, but yet, if we look at it, for instance, there is this anxiety or worry that, after such an impressive three, 4 decades of remarkable growth, that maybe we come to a place of stagnation. John Gong here in the studio. How do you look at that?
Well, first of all, let me say that the idea of a middle income trap is sort of a concept. It's a theory, it's a hypothesis. It describes a situation where some economies may experience rapid growth early stage, but later on it just stagnated. This is what we call a middle income trap.
Well, okay. I'm going to say, because according to the World Bank, there are some very clear boundary. According to the World Bank, the middle income trap refers to a situation where countries that have successfully grown from low income to middle income status struggle to advance further and become high income economies, and often rely on policies predicated on superficial measures on economic efficiency. And as I said, according to the World Bank in 2024, 108 countries are considered to be in a middle income trap, including China. So it is not just a shifting idea. There are hard criteria again.
Well, the idea is that I think the whole idea is about countries got stuck in this middle category for many, many years, isn't able to break into the high income category. I think by getting very close to that, or as I have argued that we've already reached that point probably at this point, it's a very symbolic breakthrough, I would say. sort of rhetorically we can claim that we are going to say goodbye to this so-called middle income
So
trap.
we escaped. So China escaped.
Yeah, so I think we are, or at least we're very close to escaping that, or we've already somehow just escaped. I guess that's the idea. So I think it's a great achievement. And going back to your chart, I would say that it's not unseen that economies can grow for a very rapid growth rate for like 2 decades. Korea, South Korea, Japan have all done that in the past. I think what's remarkable here about 2 things. One is the size of the population here. Now we're talking about 1.4 billion people, right?
1/5 of humanity.
1/5 of humanity continuously growing at this speed for over a period of 30-some years, right? This is remarkable. This is unprecedented in human history. The second point is about, as I said, it's about the extended period of time. For such a long time, no economies have experienced this kind of a growth, sustained growth, at a point even close to double-digit growth for like almost 30 years. And that's remarkable, I guess.
So here's the question, because over the past couple of years, the growth rate, or that line, which was very steep, I should do it this way, kind of slow down a little bit.
It's happening for two. Yeah, it's happening for 2 reasons. First of all, there's a sky is the limit, right? There's this convergence theory that as countries moving from developing countries towards developed countries, their growth rate is inevitably going to slow down. You're not going to see this kind of spectacular growth close to double-digit growth anymore for such a large economy. It's already grown very, very big, right? To have, say, 5% growth this year, it's almost saying that we have a new economy of the size of Australia in a whole year. So it's very difficult. We're getting close to 5%, even less than 5% growth these days. That's the first reason. The second reason has to do with as I said, it has to do with RMB dollar exchange ratio. Exchange rate. In the past few years, RMB has been depreciating, right? And up until probably, towards the end of last year, we're starting to see RMB coming back again. So, that's the second reason why this curve is starting to level off.
Because money made in China is renminbi.
We calculated GDP and GNI in RMB, and then we convert that into US dollar, right? So the exchange rate really matters here.
It's a bigger part. Professor Liang Yan, what is your take? Do you agree with Zhang Gong in his explanation, or do you have something to add?
Oh, he has to agree. She has to agree.
I have so much to add. I would agree with John, but I would just want to add one more thing, which I think is important, which is I think this is China's own strategic pivot, right? 2017 is when this high quality development strategy was brought forth. And so the point here is that as China mature, as it reached the high income level status, what is more important now is the quality of growth. And that goes back to the middle income track. And you're right, World Bank has put up these evidence that many countries stuck in this middle income track. In fact, their study shows that by 2008, only 13 countries out of the 101, the so-called middle income country back in 1960s, were able to escape that. So I think what is remarkable in China is just a couple of years ago, when you hear the Western narrative, it's all about China getting stuck in this middle income track. But today they're talking about China shock 2.0. So I think really what is remarkable here is that China has pivoted. It shifted from this high-speed growth to now more quality-driven, productivity growth-driven, technological innovation-driven kind of growth. So growth slows down because it pursues more quality, less, expansive growth. And one last thing that I wanted to add back to this idea, whether China is developing or developed, I'm not trying to win the heart and minds of the Western economies. As you're right, they're not solvable. But I think it's important for the global South countries to know that China is, fellow travelers, right? China is part of the developing countries world, and China has always been a responsible stakeholder, going from the development finance provider to global, governance, envisioner. I think China has been playing a very responsible role, even if it's still a second largest developing country, not the developed country.
Well, the world's largest economy in terms of purchasing power parity. But as I said, the group of high-income country, there are 87 countries, and China is not there yet, or at the bottom of it. So that shows where China is. We are going forward, but we are not there. We're not a developed country. That is, I don't know, just black and white for me. But Mr. He Weiwen on the phone, going further, is it a sure thing that China is going to keep growing at a steady 5%? Is China on track to achieving the goals it has set for itself?
Oh, yes. I think the target for the 15th five-year plan is envisaged at between 4.5 to 5.0% GDP growth per year. That's quite remarkable. We think that if we look back to history, that any country becoming such a size of economy will certainly slow down its growth speed. Now the 5%, or be it 5% or 4%, I think that will be okay for China for the coming years, because the world growth rate is 3% and 2% in the US, 1% in Europe. So 4 to 5% will be quite good. The only thing I think with the attention, the emphasis should not be the speed, but the two elements, fundamental thing. First, the disposable income of the people, whether they can raise, improve their income to have a rich life. That's the important thing.
Yeah.
The disposable personal income in China for 2025 is 43% of total GDP. That's 2025. 6 years later, 2019, the percentage was the same, 43%. So we have to improve, raise disposable income, the share in the total GDP.
Sure. It's very interesting. We talk about 5% of GDP growth, then, we think that's very good. But, if you look at the United States on the same chart about income, and John Ross, here I want you to come in here. The United States actually increased by 7% for 1 year, for, the year before 2025, from 83,000 to almost 89,000. That's quite a lot. How do you look at that?
Well, this is a statistical quirk, because actually for the US population it's very bad, because the main reason for the increase because it's nominal GDP, it was due to the high inflation, and for the population in the United States, high inflation was not a pleasant experience. Indeed, one of the things in the US is that real wages actually fell during this period, because there's two things. If the economy of the 2% of the US, basically almost all, and that's not an exaggeration, goes to the top 1% of the population. For the majority of real wages in the people on real wages in the United States, their income has been falling. Okay, Trump says that stock market is great and brilliant and points to this, but the point is that only 1% of Americans have an income from shares that's equal to their income from wages, and only 0.1% is higher. So the stock market's meaningless to them. And therefore, this is not a benefit of the situation. The high increase in nominal GDP is due to, one, the high inflation rate, and secondly, the exchange rate, which will come down, because the result of the dollar being overvalued is the US industries being gutted out.
All right. I guess we don't have the time to go further, but it's a fascinating topic. I think the takeaway from it is that this report is a good reference, but it's not everything. And even if China go into a high income economy category, it doesn't mean that China can sit back and be complacent about it. Still a lot of hard work. And there is also a wealth gap in China, I must point out, although it has been rather stable over the past couple of years. So with all of that, I have to leave it there. And many thanks to John Ross, He Weiwen, Liang Yan, and Jiang Gong for sharing with us your precious insight. And that's it for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook, X, and YouTube using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing. On behalf of the whole team, thank you for watching. You've got The Point.